I woke up to the sound of knocking on my door. I ignored it. A few moments later. But something about that rhythm was wrong. Not ordinary knocking, like a rhythm you've heard before. But one note had shifted into something else. Something off. And then, the door slowly creaked open. I looked down. The doll was standing at the entrance to my room, on her stand, staring at me. It was 1994. I had just been laid off from my job at a large paper mill in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The economy was tough, and the mill decided it didn't need half of its workforce. I happened to be part of that half. My wife, Eileen, tried her best to stay optimistic, but the mounting stress was evident in her eyes. We had two young daughters, Sarah, who was 10, and Lily, who was 7. The rent, school bills, groceries, everything demanded money, and I couldn't remember the last time I had actually held a paycheck. Eileen's cousin, Richard, worked at a meat processing plant in a town called Greenbridge, about a 6-hour drive from Halifax. He sent us a letter mentioning that the plant was hiring new hands, the pay was good, and it came with health insurance. We didn't think twice. We packed up our entire life in a week and hit the road. Greenbridge was a small town nestled right in the middle of sprawling fields and endless pastures. It had a population of about 2,000 people. The main street featured a grocery store, a pharmacy, a church, and a small cafe that opened early in the morning. The folks there had known each other for generations, and secrets traveled fast. It was the kind of town where if a stranger rolled in, everyone knew about it within a single day. We rented a 2-story house on the outskirts of town. The house was old, featuring 1970s wallpaper that peeled away to reveal layers of faded, ancient paint beneath. The floorboards groaned with every single step, especially at night when you'd get up to use the bathroom, making you feel as though the entire house was awake. The girls shared a room on the second floor, with a window overlooking the backyard and a vast barley field beyond it. Our neighbor to the right, Mrs. Carter, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s, welcomed us on our very first day with a plate of local pastries and gave us an informal tour of the town through her endless chatter. She said, "You arrived at the beginning of autumn, the best time. Just wait until winter, and you'll learn the true meaning of cold out here." The Northfield meat processing plant was just a 10-minute drive from a house, a massive structure of corrugated iron and concrete. It stood in the middle of a barren field like an industrial fortress, completely devoid of decoration. Its sheer size was a shock. I hadn't expected something so massive in such a small town. On my first day, the plant manager, a broad-shouldered man named Stephen Bradley, who had a booming voice and usually spoke in the tone of a television commercial, took me on a tour. He explained the operations, shouting louder than necessary to overcome the deafening roar of the machinery. He told me they processed about 12,000 head of cattle a day and that it was the pride of the entire region. He assigned me to the cutting department. The pay was good, well above average for the area, with overtime available most weeks. The work was brutal. Not that I was afraid of hard labor. I've worked many grueling jobs in my life, and I don't complain. But this kind of repetitive labor, the exact same motion thousands of times a single shift, does something strange to your body. My shoulders and back ached intensely every single night. And the smell was something else entirely. It seeped into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, even the back of your nasal passages. It was a heavy mixture of blood, pungent cleaning chemicals, and something else I couldn't quite define. Every day I came home, Eileen would tell me to strip down in the garage and head straight for the shower without touching a thing. The girls would laugh. Lily would pinch her nose and say that Daddy brings home the smell of the bad kitchen, while Sarah would giggle behind her hand. Eileen didn't laugh, but at the end of the day, I was content. The money was coming in. We started paying off our bills, and the girls adjusted to their new school quickly. It felt like things were finally looking up. But plants like Northfield carry stories, and their stories carry secrets. In the break room, the corridors, the locker room, Anywhere workers gathered, you'd find gossip. Some of it was trivial, rumors about this manager or that employee, but some ran deeper. My co-worker, Mark O'Reilly, a veteran who had spent 17 years at Northfield and sat half a meter from me on the production line, pointed out a window one day. From the small break room window, an old wing of the plant was visible. This wing looked completely neglected, its walls dark, and it was rarely ever used. Chewing his sandwich, he said, "That section used to be the main production line back in the 80s. That's where Walter Hughes died." I asked, "Who's Walter Hughes?" He looked at me the way people look at someone who doesn't know something glaringly obvious. "An old employee here. Died in an industrial accident back in 1988. Fell into a heavy machine. There was nothing left of him to bury." I said, "That's horrific." He replied, "And some folks aren't convinced he fell on his own." I closed my lunchbox and stared at him. "Meaning?" He lowered his voice. There was a bitter feud between Walter and another worker on the same shift. Nothing was ever proven, but the rumors lingered. Nobody has liked that area ever since. Over the next few weeks, I heard different versions of the story. In one version, the accident happened in a blade machine. In another, Walter got caught in a massive conveyor belt. The details shifted, but the core elements remained constant. An old man who spent his life at the factory, a brutal death, and unresolved suspicions. Another colleague, Frank Holman, asked me one day, "Have you worked a night shift yet?" I said, "Only once." He said gravely, "If you work it again, you'll hear things coming from the old wing. The sound of footsteps, machines turning on by themselves. The maintenance crew won't go in there alone at night." I laughed, but my laugh wasn't convincing at all. 4 months into the job, I was pulling a double shift due to a labor shortage. It was close to midnight, and I was so exhausted that the edges of my vision were starting to blur. I was walking to the restroom, taking a shortcut through a corridor that ran alongside the old wing. The floor was slick with condensation from production steam, a common occurrence in these plants. I was walking cautiously, balancing every step. Right in the middle of the corridor, I felt something, a distinct pressure against my right ankle, exactly like someone sticking their foot out to trip me. I lunged forward, my arms flailing in the air as I tried to regain my balance. To my right was an old, decommissioned piece of industrial machinery. It was turned off, but if I had fallen into it, I could have been severely injured or worse. For a split second, I felt the cold iron dangerously close. My heart leaped into my throat. I managed to dig my fingers into the wall and barely steadied myself. I stood up and spun around. The corridor was completely empty. No one, not a single soul. I stood there catching my breath, my eyes darting into the void. The light bulb directly above me chose that exact moment to flicker and die, plunging me into near-total darkness for a second. I called out, trying to sound steady but failing. "Is anyone there?" The only response came from the distant roar of machines on the other side of the plant. Nothing else. I told myself I was exhausted, that I had just slipped on the wet floor, and my overactive imagination filled in the rest. But as I walked quickly toward the well-lit section of the factory, a cold certainty settled deep inside me. Something had tried to trip me. I didn't tell Eileen. She was busy with the girls and looking for a part-time job. She had enough worries of her own. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. But a week later, something happened at the house. Eileen had taken the girls to the doctor, and I was spending my day off washing dishes. The radio was playing a soft music station. I was focused on the plates, thinking about the errands for the upcoming week. Then I felt a shove, not a gentle nudge, a distinct, forceful shove right in the middle of my back. I slammed hard into the edge of the sink, splashing soapy water all over my clothes. I spun around instantly. The kitchen was completely empty. I said, "Who's there?" Knowing how stupid such questions sound, there was no reply. I searched the entire house. Every door was locked, the windows secured. There was no sign of an intruder. I returned to the kitchen, deeply unsettled. At that exact second, the radio cut out into sharp, loud white noise. I froze. Then, it snapped back to the original station on its own, as if nothing had happened. From that point on, small occurrences began to pile up. Objects moved out of place. A sudden, biting chill would take over a specific corner of a room. There was a persistent sensation of being watched. And the shoves continued, always from behind, always when I least expected it. In the garage, on the stairs, at the stove while I was cooking. They weren't violent, but they were deliberate and constant, like someone trying desperately to get my attention. A month after these events, I casually mentioned to Mark in the break room that I had felt something strange in the side corridor a while back. I didn't give details, just told him I felt like someone tried to trip me. Mark didn't laugh. He looked at me gravely and said, "Has anything happened at your house, too?" That threw me completely. "How did you know?" He said, "Walter does that. It doesn't happen to everyone, only the ones who catch his attention." He trailed off. I asked, "What do you mean?" He gave me a strange look and said, "You look like Walter. There's something in your eyes and the shape of your cheekbones." I stood up to tell him that was absolute nonsense. He said, "There's a photo of him in the hallway near the HR office. There's a wall with pictures of employees who passed away. Go see for yourself." After my shift that afternoon, I walked over to the administration building and went looking for it. The wall was there. Small frames holding black and white or faded color photos. Beneath each picture was a small brass plaque with a name and years of service. Walter Hughes's photo was at the end of the row. A picture from the late 1980s. A man in his 60s with thinning white hair, deep dark eyes, and a prominent jawline. The plaque underneath read, "Walter Hughes, 1928 to 1988, 30 years of service." I stood frozen in front of the photograph. Mark was right. It wasn't a theatrical, identical match, but it was close enough to be uncanny. The same eye color, the same cheekbone structure. Even the way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than his right was mirrored in my own face. I stared at the picture, and for a split second, I swore his eyes shifted. A shudder ran down my spine. I took a sharp step back, nearly colliding with a secretary walking down the hall. I apologized quickly and bolted out of there. After seeing that photograph, the activity in the house intensified. The shoves grew harder. Doors began slamming shut without any draft. The television turned itself on twice in the dead of night, blasting nothing but static. The girls began complaining about recurring nightmares. Dreams of an old man standing at the foot of their beds, just staring at them. Eileen was starting to notice. One day, a shelf completely collapsed off the kitchen wall. Eileen stood amidst the shattered dishes, looked at me, and demanded, "Arthur, what is happening to this house?" I told her, "The house is old. It's just settling. The foundations aren't stable." It was a lie, and I knew it. On a Tuesday in November, I came home late from work, desperate for a hot shower to wash off the plank grime. Eileen was in the kitchen fixing dinner. The girls were in their bedroom doing homework. I turned off the water and was wrapping a towel around my waist when the screams started. This wasn't normal screaming. This wasn't playtime. It was the sound of absolute, unadulterated terror. I sprinted out of the bathroom, nearly losing my footing on the stairs. The screams were tearing out of the girls' room. Eileen had reached the door just ahead of me, rattling the knob frantically and screaming, "Sarah, Lily, open the door." I grabbed the handle. The door was locked tight, and I was positive we didn't even have locks installed on these interior doors. Sarah's voice came from inside, high-pitched and trembling. "The door won't open. We can't do it." Behind her, Lily was sobbing hysterically, unable to form words. I slammed my shoulder against the door. Pain shot straight through my bone. It didn't budge. A second time. A third. On the fourth impact, the wood around the frame splintered, and the door flew open. The girls were huddled in the far corner of the room, away from the window, clinging to one another with deathly pale faces and tears streaming down their cheeks. The window was flung wide open, the freezing November wind rushing in and violently whipping the curtains. I rushed over to them as they threw themselves into my arms. Eileen quickly slammed the window shut. I asked them, keeping my voice as calm as possible, "What happened?" Lily spoke through her tears, explaining that they were working on their homework when the door slammed shut on its own. Then the window burst open, and they saw a man. She met outside, hovering on the second floor with absolutely nothing beneath him to stand on. Sarah finished in a barely audible whisper. "He told us to come out to him. He said he would catch us." Then she added, trembling, "He looked like you, Daddy, but older, and he was so sad." I locked eyes with Eileen. No words were necessary. That night, we all slept in the living room on the large sofa. Nobody said much, but in the middle of the night, once the girls finally exhausted themselves and slept, Eileen whispered to me, "We can't stay here." That was the moment I should have confessed everything. The touch in the corridor, the shoves in the house, Walter's photograph, the striking resemblance, everything. But the words caught in my throat. I was terrified she'd think I was losing my mind, but I promised her we would find another place. After a week of staying in a small motel, we found an apartment for rent 3 hours away in a different town. I went back to the plant one last time to finalize my paperwork and say my goodbyes. As I was walking to my car at the end of the day, I passed the old wing of the factory. I stopped. I hadn't planned on doing what I did, but my body anchored itself before my mind could decide. I spoke into the empty air, keeping my voice low. "Walter, I'm sorry for what they did to you, but please, let my family go in peace." I waited for a beat, then turned, walked straight to my car, and never looked back. We moved. The new town was quieter, simpler. I took a job at the local post office. The pay was significantly less, but the hours were regular. There was no massive machinery, and no angry spirits. The activity stopped completely the day we left Greenbridge. Not a single shove, not a single window opening on its own. The girls slept soundly without nightmares, and a genuine smile finally returned to Eileen's face. I've stayed at the post office ever since. The days have become mundane and quiet, and I am deeply grateful for that mundanity. But sometimes, when I see a photograph of an old man with dark eyes and a prominent jawline, my heart skips a beat. I am reminded that places hold memories, and memories sometimes hold rage, and that rage will seek out a face that resembles the only one it knows. Walter Hughes died many years ago in a small-town factory in Canada, but his shadow spent years looking for a face to remind him of something he couldn't find peace with, and he found me. I thank God every day that I said what I said outside that old wing. I don't know if a few words can truly change anything, but ever since that day, the world has been quiet, and for me, that is more than enough. Sometimes, what you see in a single moment stays with you for a lifetime, not necessarily because it is terrifying, and not just because it is strange, but because it shatters a fundamental rule you were entirely convinced applied to the world. The rule that life has only one form, and that what you can see is all that exists. My name is Liam Foster. I am currently in my 40s, working as a history teacher at a small secondary school in South Wales. By all accounts, my life is ordinary, family, work, routine. But ever since I was a boy, I have carried something in my heart that knows the world is far wider than what appears on the surface. And that all began in my grandmother Margaret's house in the autumn of 1991. My grandmother Margaret was the kind of woman who built an entire world around herself. Her house in the small town of Penderyn in South Wales was a place with a distinct soul. It was a structure built of gray stone, featuring high ceilings, large windows, and curtains that were always left half open. It carried a unique scent, a blend of old wood, the apple wax she used to melt in the winter, and yellowed, vintage books. Penderyn was a tiny town of no more than 1,500 people. It had a single petrol station, a church, a primary school, and a small supermarket that opened from 9 in the morning until 7 at night. People had known each other for generations, and gossip traveled fast. It was the kind of place where secrets lived for a while before slowly drifting to the surface at their own pace. I used to visit my grandmother every now and then with my little sister, Amy, who was 2 years younger than me. We loved that house. In the kitchen, there was always something delicious simmering on the stove. Grandmother always had a story to tell, and the backyard featured a massive apple tree you could climb to look out over the sprawling fields beyond. The guest room in that house was a remarkably peaceful space. An old brass bed, pale pink curtains, and a heavy wool rug on the floor. Right next to the bed stood a vintage chair from a bygone era. It was a wooden chair with an armchair back upholstered in dark green fabric, looking as though it belonged to the pre-war years. It was always in the exact same spot, unmoved for as long as I could remember. I was 10 years old, perhaps 11. I had come for a routine visit to my grandmother's house with my mother and Amy. We spent the day normally, ate a warm dinner, sat in the living room talking, and went to bed early. I was sleeping alone in the guest room because Amy, as was her habit, preferred to sleep with grandmother. The night was profoundly quiet, and the brass bed felt incredibly warm beneath the heavy blankets. In the morning, when I opened my eyes to the pale light filtering through the curtains, I automatically glanced toward the old chair beside the bed. Someone was sitting in it. At first, I thought my mother or grandmother had walked in to check on me. But then I noticed that the figure in the chair was not the size of an adult. It was a little girl. She looked no older than 8 or 9. Her pitch black hair was tied into 2 symmetrical braids, pulled tight, with 2 dark blue satin ribbons. She wore a white dress with a high collar, long sleeves, and a delicate, subtle pattern across the chest. The dress was the kind you only ever see in old photographs from around the turn of the 20th century. My heart stopped for a second, and then I noticed a second thing. I could see right through her. Not completely, not like transparent glass, but the wooden chair beneath her and the dark green fabric were faintly visible through her body. It looked as if someone had placed a transparency film over a photograph. She was undeniably there, yet at the same time, not fully present. My body froze completely. Then, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were large and dark, and her expression was entirely serene. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't sad. It was more as if she felt completely comfortable in that space, and she saw something in me that didn't scare her at all. She smiled. It was the ordinary, natural smile of a little girl, the kind that makes your cheeks puff up slightly. Then, she raised her small hand and moved it in a gentle wave. From the silent movement of her lips, I read a single word: hello. In that exact second, the terror I expected to feel never came. Instead, I was washed over by a strange, sudden wave of absolute calm. In a quiet voice, barely loud enough to hear myself, I replied, "Hello." Her smile widened, and then she began to fade. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden disappearance, but a slow dissolve, the way dawn slowly consumes the shadows of the night. Within 10 seconds, she was completely gone, and the chair was empty once more. I remained sitting up in bed, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My heart was beating faster than usual, but I wasn't afraid. I was certain of one thing: what I saw was real. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't my imagination. She had been right there. I didn't tell the adults at first. Children instinctively know that there are things grown-ups simply won't believe, and I was at an age where I feared being accused of lying or having an overactive imagination more than anything else. But that image remained locked in my mind. The 2 braids tied with blue ribbon, the vintage dress, the serene smile, and her large eyes carrying the look of someone entirely at peace in their surroundings. I began reading history books, driven by a deep curiosity. I searched through pages detailing historical clothing to verify the era of the garments she wore. The dress, the braids, and the ribbons all pointed to the period between roughly 1900 and 1920. If she had been a child from that era, she would have been well over 100 years old by now. When I indirectly asked my grandmother about the history of the house, she told me it had been built in 1908 and that a family had lived there for decades before she bought it in the 1960s. She mentioned hearing that the previous family had a little girl who passed away from an illness during her childhood, though she didn't know the details. I never told her that I had seen her. Months passed. Winter faded. Spring arrived, and with it came Easter. On Easter Eve, my parents would always have us sleep over at my grandmother's house, so we could wake up in the morning to find our gift baskets. It was an old family tradition that Amy loved even more than I did, as she was still at that magical age of being utterly delighted by surprises. That Easter night, we went to bed early, Amy in grandmother's room, and I in the guest room as usual. Winter was ending, but the night was still biting cold, and the blanket felt heavy and comforting. In the morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred, the first light of dawn began to creep beneath the curtains. It was that pale, colorless light that only exists in the fleeting minutes just after dawn, right before the true sun rises. I woke up slowly and sat up in bed. I turned my gaze toward the living room, visible through the slightly ajar door, and I saw her again. She was sitting on the sofa in the living room. The exact same braids, the same blue ribbons, the same vintage dress. The pale light streaming through the living room windows passed through her in the exact same way it had the first time. But this morning, she appeared slightly clearer. It was as if the natural morning light made her more distinct, not less. She looked at me, her eyes widening with something resembling pure joy. She smiled, a smile much wider than the first time. I smiled back and waved my hand in greeting. She responded with an even more enthusiastic wave, her small hand moving quickly as she nodded. Her body leaned forward slightly on the sofa, just like someone who is genuinely happy to see a familiar face. I whispered in a very faint voice, "Good to see you again." She nodded rapidly, as if she understood, agreed, and remembered. Suddenly, from the bedroom down the hall, my grandmother's voice called out, "Liam, what are you doing up? Go back to sleep. It's too early for breakfast." I turned toward the sound of her voice for a split second. When I looked back at the sofa, the girl was gone. The sofa was completely empty. The pale light was hitting my grandmother's patterned cushions, casting no shadows. Grandmother peered out from her room, wearing her brown wool robe and looking at me with half-asleep eyes. She asked in a gentle tone, "Who were you talking to, Liam?" I looked at the sofa one last time and replied, "No one, Grandma. I was just talking to myself." She didn't look entirely convinced, but she didn't press further. She simply went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. I walked back into the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and lost myself in thought. Shortly after that Easter, my grandmother decided it was time to move. Old age was starting to take its toll, and that two-story house had become far too large for her to maintain. She moved into a small apartment closer to my mother so they could look after her. The house was sold to a new family. What I never could have expected was that this family had a daughter around the same age as my school friend, Melanie Cheeseman. Melanie and her family lived nearby, and she began spending a lot of time at that house visiting her friend. A year after my grandmother moved out, Melanie approached me one day after school while I was packing my bag. She looked hesitant, as if she couldn't quite decide whether to share what was on her mind. "Liam," she said, "there's something really strange about the house my friend lives in." I looked at her. "What is it?" She whispered, "A little girl. I've seen her twice now. She sits in the living room in the early morning. She has braids and blue ribbons in her hair." I stopped dead in my tracks. I asked her quietly, "Is her dress white and very old-fashioned?" Melanie stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "How could you possibly know that?" We sat down on the stone steps outside the school, and I told her everything. The first time in the guest room, the second time on Easter morning in the living room, the smile, the wave, the blue ribbons, and the vintage dress. Melanie listened intently, without interrupting me once. When I finished, she asked, "She didn't seem bad, did she?" "No," I told her. "Quite the opposite. She seemed entirely at peace. She treated me completely normally." Melanie said in a soft voice. I felt the exact same way. The second time I saw her, she smiled at me like someone who had known me for years. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Melanie asked, "What do you think has kept her in that house all these years?" I thought about it for a moment before replying. Maybe she just doesn't feel the need to leave. Maybe that place is simply her home. She doesn't carry any malice or anger. She's just living her life. Melanie looked down at the ground, like someone who is simply attached to a place they love. Yes, I said, exactly like that. Since that day, I have grown up and replayed those moments in my mind countless times. I studied history and became a teacher. Sometimes during a lesson, when I am talking to my students about the past and the people who lived in different eras, I get a strange sensation, a realization that the past isn't nearly as distant as it seems. Some things endure, not necessarily because they are tragic or trapped in pain, but simply because they loved the space they occupied. That little girl, whose name I never learned, lived in that house in the early 20th century. She passed away young from an unnamed illness, and she simply stayed. She never appeared to be suffering. To me, she seemed to simply exist, watching the people who come and go. And occasionally, when someone happens to see her, she smiles and waves, like a little girl saying, "I'm here. You might not see me normally, but I am here." If someone were to ask me today, after all these years, whether spirits truly exist, I would tell them that I don't hold the definitive philosophical answer, but I know with absolute certainty that I saw something with my own eyes twice that cannot be explained by conventional logic. And in both instances, there was no fear, no threat, and no malice. There was only the peaceful presence of an entity that was, once upon a time, a little girl who loved the home she lived in. Melanie still lives in that same area today, and she mentions that she has caught glimpses of the girl a few more times over the years. Always the same braids, always the same blue ribbons, and always that same serene smile. As for me, whenever Easter comes around and brings with it that pale, early morning light, I feel a profound warmth in my chest. I remember my grandmother's old house, and I picture that little girl sitting on the sofa, waving, and I find myself wondering if she still remembers me too.